All right, welcome to the introduction to Yao, which is the excerpt from the longer novel Homegoing by Yao Gyasi. I want to begin by reviewing some information on post-colonial literature. So this is something you should be familiar with. We talked about this when we did Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, and also when we did Jamaica Kincaid's Girl. So remember that post-colonial literature is literature that is concerned with the effect colonization had and continues to have on colonized peoples. So as a reminder, colonization is the military, economic, and cultural oppression and domination of one country over another. One of the strongest ways that a colonizer can control another group, the colonized group, is through the use of culture. For example, in the story, Yao himself talks about going to school. So if you are a village child growing up in Ghana, not have you may not have the opportunity to go to school, which means that you may end up living in perpetual poverty. The few children in each village that do go to school end up getting a Western education. So Yao says, um, he says, besides, if we go to the white man for school, we will just learn the way the white man wants us to learn. We will come back and build the country the white man wants us to build, one that continues to serve them. We will never be free. So here you see this kind of cultural catch-22 by providing schools, the colonizer, even though they don't have any sort of political power, continues to colonize the oppressed people. So if they want economic freedom, they have to go to school, but that just sort of continues the influence of the colonizer on the oppressed people. Let's talk a little bit about the cultural background and the history of Ghana. So it was inhabited as early as 3000 or 4000 BCE, meaning those are the first settled peoples come to live there. They are probably most famous for their gold. They were known at one time as the Gold Coast. Portuguese will become the first European power to start trading with Ghana. And so they'll learn of the like immense amounts of gold. And by the 16th century, by the 1500s, many Europeans have started to trade and try to get access to the Ghanans' gold. By the 17th century, the 1600s, the Ashanti people in Ghana lead a series of successful operations and become an independent empire. So at one point, they are an independent empire, and that independent empire will last into the 1800s, even though the British are at this point attempting to colonize Ghana. So the Ashanti will establish trading posts with European powers. They will help to also build slave castles and help to build slave castles, and Ghana will become a major slave trade economy. Those castles, by the way, many of them still stand. So there's like now like this tourist industry built around them. You can go see where captured Africans were kept before they could be shipped from Africa to the New World. Okay, so Great Britain starts to gain control slowly in the 1700s. And by the end of World War II, Ghana is the richest and most educated territory in West Africa. In part, this is because of all of the gold. In part, this is because of their slave history. In part, it is because of all of the Christian-based education, like the missionary schools and things like that. With education comes this spread of nationalism. As people become more and more educated, they become more and more empowered, and then the spirit of independence starts to grow. And so by 1947, they start to hold talks with Great Britain to try to move towards becoming independent, breaking away as a colony. And they'll gain their independence in 1956. For quite some time, there is instability. So about almost 20 years, there are several coups, military takeovers of the government, and there's constant changing of power. But by 1992, which may sound like a long time ago for some of y'all, by 1992, they have a fairly stable government. That means that they've been stable for roughly 30 odd years. Okay, Yaa Gyasi is born in Ghana in 1989. She is the daughter of a professor who will end up coming to America to teach in Huntsville in Alabama. and her mother, Sophia, is a nurse. So she is the daughter of educated people. She's in some ways very privileged. So her family moves to the United States when she is not yet 2 years old, and they live primarily in Alabama. From the age of 10, Yagyasi will live in Alabama almost exclusively. Because she's an immigrant, she really didn't have a lot of friends. She was a cultural outsider, much like, say, Sherman Alexie. And so this sense of being outside of the culture is something that she often writes about. Being an outsider is something that she often writes about. So for her, books were her closest friends, and so she talks about certain authors who had a good influence on her, mainly Toni Morrison, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, James Baldwin, Edward P. Jones, and Jhumpa Lahiri. Two of them we have actually read, and we've actually also talked about Marquez as the sort of primary influence in Latin American magical realism. Okay. So when she is a child, she'll actually receive a certificate of achievement from LeVar Burton, who did Reading Rainbow. I don't know if you guys remember Reading Rainbow. That might be before your time, but that was quite the big deal. So she wins this contest for a short story, and that inspires her to become an author. She'll earn a bachelor's degree in English at Stanford, and then go on and get a master's. Shortly after graduating from Stanford, even while she is working on her master's, she begins writing her first novel. And her first novel, Homegoing, was inspired by a trip back home to Ghana. So she was born there, but she grew up almost exclusively in the United States. So it was her first trip back since leaving the country as an infant. It takes her about, 5 or 6 years to actually write it. And before it's even published, there's all kinds of buzz about this novel, and she will end up making millions on this one first book. She was very young at the time period. She was still in her 20s, and in some ways I kind of hate her because here she wrote this beautiful piece of literature at such a young age and became a millionaire in the process, and writing novels is something that I've always wanted to do. Her novel, anyways, is a good example of post-colonial literature. So let's talk a little bit about post-colonial concerns and review some of those again. Remember that some of the goals here of post-colonial literature are reclaiming spaces and places. So the idea that we reclaim this space for Ghanaian culture and Ghanaian people, asserting cultural integrity. Our culture, our language has just as much value as your culture or your language, and revising history. And all three of these you can see coming to play in this short story. Some of the generic characteristics of post-colonialism: resistant descriptions. So these subscriptions that work to resist stereotypes, for example. The appropriation of the colonizer's language. What I find interesting about this particular story is there's a lot of discussion of language and the power of language, and how language is part of that colonization process. And then the reworking of colonial art forms. So for instance, to take the novel and rework the novel. And in fact, this novel, Homegoing, of which you just get this one excerpt, is a series of stories that is told sort of generationally, starting with the sort of early days of African slavery and moving it up to the present. And each chapter tells the story of one child of each generation. So every 20 years or so, the novel jumps in time, each chapter, another 20 years, another 20 years, and it's constantly changing perspective. So, so chapter 1 might begin in Africa in the same year that chapter 2 begins, but in the New World. And then chapter 3 goes back to Africa some 20, 25 years into the future, and so on and so forth. So the author is definitely reworking that colonial art form of the novel. So these are the characteristics I want you to be on the lookout for, both these sort of generic characteristics and these post-colonial concerns. Be on the lookout for these as you read the story, and then we'll meet back for the lesson.